Okay, hello everyone. My name's Ben Eady, and I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Fast Tracking Projects. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, VP of Marketing and Strategic Alliances with IAG Consulting. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature on the webinar software. I would also like to say thank you to IAG Consulting for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Hey, thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. Yes, today's discussion is fast-tracking project concepts, and it's really a webinar that's all about efficiently finding the gas pedal on concepts. You know, this is all about that pre-project stage, and a lot of times organizations have real problems with this. First and foremost, because they don't even recognize that they've got a pre-project stage, and it gets into this whole, you know, what string are you trying to pull to make the thing go forward? So requirements are really not just about a document somewhere that you're going to sit on a shelf. If you do it right, the whole requirements process is part of the business that can really help to accelerate that business and becoming much, much more nimble and execute far more quickly. So if you're a project manager that's here today and say, well, how do I find the gas on projects and how do I find that gas pedal? Hey, you come to the right place. If you're an analyst that's really saying, hey, look, I'm dealing with some very large things. How do I get those things accelerated quickly? Then you come to the right place. And let's talk about it. A little bit of housekeeping as well on top of what Ben was talking about. The PDU and CDU information is on the last slide of the deck today. So you got to stick around to the end to go get that. If you're interested in my slide deck, you just need to send an email to kls@iag.biz, which is on the lower left-hand side, or you can send it to Adrian just to keep him busy. He's on the lower right-hand side. And those email addresses will also be on the last slide of the deck. Also, this is your chance to be as interactive as you want to be. Throw me the curveball questions, throw me whatever it is you want to talk about, and we'll, as long as it's relevant to the presentation, then and we'll deal with that as we go. Now, we only have about 900 people on the line today, so you know I try to make sure I answer every single question as we go. Pop them in there, and you know I'll try to answer them as I go, and we'll pick them up as we go along. That way, we can make it as interactive. So, what are we going to talk about today? You know, some companies do awesome requirements, but they're lousy at scoping in the whole project intake process. So overall they have, you know, poor requirements processes. But it's really not in the way they're doing the requirements. It's really in their intake process. And so you get the situation where the CIO is constantly faced with, you know, on some of these little itty-bitty projects, they've got a 40-page description of what the project is all about, like all the wrong information, but it's 40 pages. You've got to go through an entire deck of information. But then on this big multi-million-dollar, stage thing, they've only got a paragraph or two about what that whole thing is about. It's enough to drive anybody crazy, right? Now, quickly shaping that amorphous thing into a specific project, you know what, that even as a word, even as a, what do we call that in business? It happens every single day, but what do we call it in business? I had to put a name on it. I called it crystallization, taking that big amorphous cloudy thing and turning it into something specific because, you know what, it's one of these process areas that people tend not to recognize in companies, but it's real important. And now I'm going to share with you some example projects and kind of walk you through that, but I'm also going to walk you through that actionable framework because I think at the end of the day, what we want to make sure of is that you've got some really good concepts that you can take away and use tomorrow. I don't want to make this one of those, you know, hey, this, you know, Chicken Little, the sky is falling and the world is going to end. No, we want to walk away from a conversation like this where you've got some good ideas that you can take away, regardless of where you're coming from, and then kind of work on that from there. So who is IAG Consulting? I think it's important to give you guys some context of where we're coming from as an organization. We're an organization that focuses exclusively on requirements discovery and management. We've been doing that for, gosh, decades, okay? And so our whole focus in life is really one of these four things when we're working with clients. We're about as niche and as you could possibly make a services organization out there. You know, the people call me up and say, Keith, you know, I've got a project that I'd like you to work on, and that's the requirements discovery and management part. Or they could call me up and say, hey, look, we've got analysts, and we'd like you to help us to train those analysts and be much more productive, and that's the whole analyst professional development. Or people could call us up and say, you know what, we really like a lot of these practices that you've been talking about. Let's, you know, we want to ingrain some of that in our own organization. Or they call us and say, hey, we're trying to put in a turnkey center of excellence in the whole area of requirements definition and management. Can you help us do that? And the core competency underlying our entire company is this whole idea of elicitation. How do you reach out and engage? How do you reach out and engage the stakeholders and extract that set of business information that they have and do that in a repeatable and predictable way? And we're a little bit religion, right? We're a little bit religious about, how do you get clear, accurate, and complete requirements. It's just part of the fundamentals of it. Kelvin, how can I gather requirements? What are the best approach? I'm actually going to give you a little bit of a sense of that as we go through this, at least initiating some of that, Kelvin. And I know this is going to be kind of funny to say, but if you're having problems with the audio, it's cutting in and out, I suggest take it off of voice over IP and dial into the actual phone line, and that'll reduce that kind of cut in and cut out. So here's a quick bio of IAG, and this is the last slide on us. We've been at this for 14 years or so. We've done over 1,200 projects in this whole area. So we are very intimate in the area of initiating projects with companies and helping them to get on top of this very quickly. Most of the time people will call me up and say, hey, Keith, I got an easy one for you today. Usually they're dealing with something that is much, much more complicated on the way through, okay? We've got a lot of organizations that we work with every single year, and I think we've trained something like 20 or 30,000 business analysts over the years, and people do engage us to help them with the technologies of business analysis and project management and things like that. So let's take a look at the learning objectives. And here's one of those things where I challenge you guys. If I don't hit these objectives, you make sure you send me your cranky email, okay? If I do, fabulous. Look forward to hearing from you that you like this session. But really what we want to do is accomplish 3 things. We want to look inside the project intake process. Why is intake so dysfunctional? And I think it's important to take it apart and really challenge people's assumptions and look at that. The next thing is the action plan. So simple steps that really drive project clarity. Stepping back and saying, well, okay, so we recognize that there's a problem in here. How do we fix this? What are the go-to things? I want you all to walk away with a simple set of go-to ideas, simple techniques that you're going to use to initiate and unlock a project. Move it forward very, very aggressively because you want to get some fairly specific targeted results. And these targeted results are time-tested. We've used them 1,200 times. Let's use these kinds of concepts to make the thing move forward. Now let's stop and talk about intake because we need to define it. What is it? It's like, in any company where you might have, $30 to $40 million client-side spend on development, you might have something like this. At a 50,000-foot level, you've got maybe 1,000 concepts that are floating around in the heads of various executives, et cetera. And that might lead to maybe 300 proposals, and those 300 proposals, might turn into something like 100 projects. And somewhere, you really hope, at some point in time, between the concepts and the projects actually showing up, certain characteristics get attached to these ideas. The sponsor shows up, stakeholders get identified, governance, begins to get aligned to this thing, objectives show up, benefits are articulated, there are cost boundaries that are determined, there's a certain time sensitivity, and God forbid, requirements are figured out. Somewhere in there, you're hoping that this is going to happen. And, here's the problem, all right? If your boss hands you, we need to adjust our order management process so that we're capturing, marketing campaign code or something like that, it's just not a big deal, right? All of those characteristics are very, very simple to figure out. But if you're in a situation where your boss says, we're 6 days from order to delivery and we need to make it 36 hours, and you're a global multinational, well, that's big. You can't easily get your head around that concept. Well, what does that mean to our organization? Who are these people that are going to be involved in this? We need to implement global account management. Go work with these 5 SVPs and figure it out. We're starting a new division, and we're going to offer our services in Moscow. Figuring out those kinds of things, they're much more complicated. You're dealing with a strategic class of project. And trying to hook in, well, who are the stakeholders? Let's get some sponsorship, all these other kinds of things, all of a sudden become much more cumbersome. You can't easily get your head around, well, what is this thing? So you got to step back and say, well, what's wrong with this process? And fundamentally, a lot of companies just don't even admit that they exist. You know, they might have portfolio management systems, but the fundamental flaw in the portfolio management system is you got to tell the system what that portfolio element is, right? It might drive you absolutely and completely bonkers trying to figure it out. There are minimal resources to deal with the large volume of projects. In fact, you're in a situation where oftentimes there's not direct funding available to help you move these things forward. You can't get the requirements until you get the business case. You can't get the business case until you get a project manager. You can't get the project manager until you've got your reference case figured out, and that reference case needs the requirements. It's kind of a circular argument, right? Drives you crazy. The whole idea that governance, project management, and requirements management are really at war almost. And I use a very strong word, war, because one is preventing the other. One is fighting constantly with the other, and you can't just say, okay, here's my line of attack. This is the set of things I am going to do all the time, and that will help us fix it. And you get this situation where stakeholders, I call them over-enthusiastic, under-directed, unimpressed, and unavailable, which is typical. You've got your stakeholder who's really trying to drive this thing, the sponsor who thinks this is a great idea, and they get over-enthusiastic. They start running off oftentimes, even though they're very experienced executives. In some very bizarre ways, sometimes they get under-directed as a result. So they're not choosing an optimal path, and it creates a lot of dust in the air while their peers are busy looking at things and saying, well, I don't know how this is going to impact, but sure as anything, it's going to take resources away from what I want to accomplish, and they're unimpressed and sometimes unavailable. So oftentimes it's difficult to get a singular motivation toward driving a particular project, and you've got to set up, or oftentimes you get stuck in a situation where you're trying to set expectations way, way, way too early in the process. What's the first question out of the stakeholders or a sponsor's mind when they go to the IT organization's office? What's the first question? You just throw it into the Q&A area. What's that first question people are going to ask? Exactly, Brian. How much? How much is this going to cost, right? How much is it going to cost? And so invariably you're stuck in this position, or how much time, right, exactly, Vanessa. So how much and when is it going to be done? Thank you, Tom. All of these things, right, all of these things are, you're too early in the process to be able to answer. You've got to say, well, what is the thing, right? In fact, what you've got is, and there's no further do you need to look as to why projects are so messed up today. Out of every 100 projects started, 94 will start over again at least once, and that's a statistic from the Chaos Report, right? Standish Group. 94 will start over again at least once. How messed up is this as a process? 94% failure rate of the process. That's pretty bad, right? What I want you to think about is how much of your organization's resource is consumed by this problem. Probably a fair bit. But instead, if you try to reroute and you try to change this by having some go-to ways that always work of dealing with this situation, it means that this whole thing can be much more effective, and you personally can be that go-to person that's going to help the organization just unbundle and make this a lot easier to go get done, okay? First and foremost, I want you to answer some questions, because I'm going to, again, some of you may or may not believe me in terms of how difficult this is. But I want you to answer this for your own organization. Grab a pen, a piece of paper. This is the participative part of this presentation, okay? I want you to answer some questions for your own organization. When do you know your project is organized and has momentum? If you want to throw it into the Q&A area, that's fine too. You can do that. When do you know your project is organized and has momentum? And if you don't know, you can just say, I don't know. Okay? I really don't know. Okay, fine. BRAC funding is it. There you go. How do you know when a general expression of interest is a project? How do you know what a general expression of interest is? Now, you're not allowed to say that one. Who is it? Yeah. And a couple of Daniels on the line here. One of them is saying, depends on the seniority of the person asking. Okay, you can't say that. How do you know when a general expression of a project? How long does it take you to go from concept to business requirements on a very complex project? Here's a good one. After the dev is ready to provide. Okay. When the CIO commits resources to the scope. You got a lot of interesting questions, but write them down for yourself, okay? Write them down for yourself. Because I'm going to challenge you on this, is that many of you can't answer some of these questions. And you're invariably in a situation is if you're not clear, there's no target outcome. There's no trigger. There's no consistency in action. And therefore, you have one messed up process. Okay, recognize the answers to these questions are all about the outcome, the trigger, the consistency in action. Those are the things that create a consistent process. That means it's repeatable, and you can deal with it over and over and over again. So what I'm going to suggest to you, I'm going to take some of my people here who have answered, and I'm going to take many of your answers are what I would have said in some of these areas, right? Because there are certain answers that really simplify the process. If you basically say, when you know your project is organized and has momentum, some of you said, well, when I have a work plan. In fact, I think it was probably the more common of the responses in there. It's when you have scope, the stakeholders, and a workable requirements plan. You may not have the full work plan for the project, but certainly if we can agree that if you had a plan to go get the requirements and figure out what the project is, you'd be better off, right? When do you know you have a general expression of interest in the project? I love the one. Somebody said it depends on the title of the person. Well, yeah, but that doesn't always work, right? When the stakeholders agree to an action plan. I think Kim was saying that, and Mary was saying that. There's a few of you who were saying that. When the stakeholders agree to an action plan and commit the required resources. I missed somebody in there that said that as well. I can't remember who that person was. How long does it take you to go from concept to momentum? Momentum now, okay? I said momentum on a very complex project. I'm going to challenge you that it should never be more than 2 weeks. We've done some $70 million projects where you can go from concept to momentum on a very, very, very complicated project. And really, people tend to take too long in this phase to do this kind of thing. You really should never be more than 2 weeks in increments to away. And oftentimes you get the requirements done in a couple of weeks, right? But use the requirements process to derive your project. Use it to, pull apart that string and give you efficient action. And I'm going to define that go-to process. Somebody asked me earlier, hey, how do I go get the requirements? Well, I'm going to tell you a couple of ideas that are the initiation phase. And it's really all about crystallizing your project. Now you've got, what you're doing is you're going from an airy-fairy fluffy thing that's in somebody's head to what does this mean in terms of a project? That's what you're trying to accomplish at this phase, right? You're trying to get your head around it. You're trying to get your arms around it. You're trying to figure out who the people that are involved in this thing. You're crystallizing it is the word that I'm going to coin to use it. And let's take a look at just an example, okay? Paisanos wants you to implement a new customer order management system. The company wants to modernize and reduce its time to deliver orders by 15 minutes, blah, blah, blah. This project needs to include the applications, head office infrastructure, corporate stores. Actually, it's, and the CEO wants to see us cut costs. I'm not even sure if that's on the screen any longer, but so we need to identify opportunities for synergy, all these other kinds of things, right? So what do we do? What do we do? You know what? This is typical of any kind of large-scale project, in that there's a lot of noise on the screen, right? There's a lot of information coming at you. There's a lot of, when you get that new piece of information, you need to step back and say, well, what does that mean? What is that? How do I work with that? And it's kind of like that movie Die Hard. You remember Die Hard 2 when you've got, that point where Bruce Willis or the Jeremy Irons, I guess, who's the bad guy, was saying that Bruce Willis and Samuel Jackson, who are the good guys, reads them a riddle. As I was going to St. Ives, I met a man with 7 wives. Every wife had 7 sacks. Every sack had 7 cats. Every cat had 7 kittens. Kittens, cats, sacks, and wives. How many were going to St. Ives? Remember that joke? I mean, I'm showing my age by going back there. But anyway, the answer to the question is in the first line. As I was going to St. Ives, there's one, right? One person going to St. Ives. In this case here, the answer is in the first line. What do we do? Well, Paisanos wants you to implement a new customer order management system. The first thing you got to do is say, well, what is a customer order management system? What is that thing? Talk to me about this. We need to figure out what that is, right? Because as soon as you know that, you start to understand the dimensions of this thing. You start to understand the scope of it, at least from an analyst's perspective, right? and you begin to unravel that thing. So what I'm going to suggest is your first go-to thing, right? Your go-to process has to be figuring out, what is this thing? Not who is around it, what is it? And there are two dimensions to scope. There's an internal perspective and an external perspective. And the internal perspective, as William rightly points out, is really all about what is the process that we're talking about in here. Give me a quick overview of this thing. What broad steps are involved? When is this process done? What are the general variations that we're dealing with? And you're really, dealing at a very high level in terms of you're doing what's we call a high-level scenario. And I'm going to give you a little bit more about that in just a second. The external perspective is who or what are we sharing information with, and what is being shared. And the two are very important, and people tend to forget one or the other. So I'll give you a sense of it. The internal perspective, oftentimes people call in those use cases, but you may have many different ways of modeling business process. But it's really, you're looking at yourself and you're saying, what is it that we do? What does the business need to accomplish? The external perspective is like this. It's probably easiest to visualize like this. When you build any large or sizable information system, or you're doing any large project of some kind, it's like throwing a rock in a pond. Right? It creates ripples. And those ripples connect. They roll out and they connect with the outside or the shore in some way. Now, what you have to do is figure out, well, where is it touching? Where is it connecting? If you're building any information system today, there are always points of interface. There are always these points of connection that you've got to go figure out. So that's the important, critical thing that you need to deal with when you're in here. Because first and foremost, that's what you've got to try to accomplish, right? What do you do if the stakeholders, okay, Andrew, so what do you do if the stakeholders really do not have any idea on what they're implementing? They think it's simple and more complex. In fact, that's what the whole thing is here all about, is you're really trying to, that you can't assume that stakeholders know what it is that they're getting into. But you can assume that stakeholders can begin answering some fairly basic questions. What is this process that we're really talking about? What starts it? What stops it? What are the general things that we are doing in here? Because the more questions that you ask them in that area, Andrew, the more you will begin uncovering how big this thing is. Don't take the stakeholders' word, hey, this is just a really small thing. Ask those basic questions, and it will uncover it for you. What do you do when the stakeholders have extreme conflicting goals for the project? Brandon, that one's a tougher one because it depends on what basis the conflicting goals are set. So sometimes they are structural conflicts, meaning two different executives have a different view of how the process is going to work, and that's fine. You just need to get those two people in a room, and you need to have them bash it out and work on it together. If there are issues with respect to the prioritization of the goals themselves, then first and foremost what you need to do is start separating out the way the goals are structured so that you've got clear understanding of vision, goal, and objective, and then have people start, if there's a lot of conflict there, have people prioritize and let them decide on what is the priority in there. And that will help you uncover it, Brandon. But it depends on if it's structural, if it's truly vision-oriented in your goaling. So from an internal perspective, let's kind of pummel through this. And Dominic, I'm going to give you that. How long is the time frame to uncover internal perspective, and how many players are involved? Dominic, on a $17 million project, we've done that in 2 weeks, okay? And we had 40-odd people in the room. So you can cruise through that extremely quickly, and let me give you a sense of how you do it. People will get bogged down into too much detail. What you need to do is have people describe what they do in the process. So if we're dealing with something like a customer order management system, right, you might be dealing with very high-level statements like taking an order, pricing an order, preparing an order, delivering an order. And so you're really asking, well, what is it you're doing, and then what do you do, and then what do you do, and then what do you do? And then as soon as somebody says, well, that depends, you know that you've gone too deep in the process. You're looking for things that people always do. I always take an order. I always price an order. I always prepare an order. And you're looking for the slight variation. So you say, okay, when you're delivering an order, what are the things that we need to be considering? What starts this? What starts this process? Give me an idea of the broad steps. So when we're taking an order, just give me a sense of the broad things that can happen when you're taking an order. What is that process called taking an order done? What ends it? because you're dealing this very, very quickly. And then finally, and most importantly, who does this activity? Because that starts to tell you, well, who do I need to have in the room when I go talk about it in detail? Tom, absolutely, this is a high-level process flow, but it's at a very generic scoping level. See, what you're doing is you're at the highest level identifying the basic elements of the business that are being covered and who needs to be in the room when you need to do it and how many of these different business processes are there and how complicated are they. So that gives you a very good idea of how much size or how much resource is going to be required to go figure out the rest of this. Should budgets be a factor to discuss at this point in the project, Francis? I wouldn't do that because you've got no idea how big it is until they start going in and starting to describe these things. People might say there is a constraint on this project that I can only spend this amount, but it's the business that would constrain it, not IT telling people how big this thing is. The typical perspectives, when you start getting down into this, is describe what you do in this process. Okay, so you're going to take it one level further, and you start saying, well, what are the typical scenarios that exist? Well, we've got takeout and delivery and phone in and walk in and, et cetera, and pricing order. So what you're doing in here is you're starting to eliminate these things and ask the questions that will help you to eliminate them. Oh, wait a minute now, credit card payment. You're right, that's not part of our process. We've got, Karen over there in another area. She's doing that particular thing. We're not talking about eat-in. It's also delivery. So we're not talking about the store management system. We're only talking about, and store inventory management, we're only talking about the call-in centers customer management system. Fabulous. That really narrows down the scope of what it is that we now need to deal with, and it helps you to identify the variations that you now need to talk about when you're doing this thing. Do you ever have, is this during scoping before the project is approved? Allison, typically that's where I would go. You really need to think about bolting this in because it's a very, very fast process. If you're dealing with a $1 to $2 million project, you're only going to spend about 4 hours doing this. You might even spend only about 2 hours doing this and just kind of get the basics of this thing figured out. And then that way, it might make it easier to determine if a project should be approved or not. Now, how your SDLC works, how your project management process works, I don't know. So it may be that it happens before, during, or after that. But those are interdependent but independent process. The approval of a project is independent of what is that project, typically. Do you ever budget time to verify the idea is the correct idea? Yes, but it's not part of this process, David. You first and foremost have to figure out, well, what is the idea? And then there's a separate thing called governance, which is this a stupid idea or not a stupid idea? And then that's probably something you need to do and you might want to think about as part of a separate process. You like this section? It's helping you. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Kelvin, if you want my slides, no problem. I will send them to you, but you got to send me an email to kls@iag.biz because remember, we got 900 people on the line today. Do you build a process flow model? Absolutely, Mary. Now, let me give you some ideas on the external perspective. We already have identified who, right? We've asked, who are the people that do this? Now you need to look at the what they're doing. So we've identified that we've got certain players at the table. One of them might be marketing. And you might say, how is marketing interacting with customers? Is the direct marketing to customers, like what are the other things that marketing could be doing? Direct marketing to customers, automated loyalty management, are those things part of the system? Because I see marketing and customers in here, and that's kind of the relationship in our customer. Is that part of, no, it's not. Okay, fabulous. How about that third-party company that we got down in there? Once we give them the order details, is there something else that they need to get? We need to know. So what else do we need to get from those people? Well, we need to get the order details, and we want to get our money. Well, oh, okay, well, who does that? Well, is that part of the process? Absolutely, we've got to have that. So you have to ask yourself the question, or you have to ask the group the question, as a result of the custom order management system, what changes might be necessary with respect to each of these identified parties that are at the table here? And by asking that simple set of questions, you identify the external perspective. By the way, for the project managers out there, each of these lines on this chart is an interdependency that is either true or not true. And if it's not true, then you've got a major problem with the project. okay? You've got a major problem with the project. You may have a failure, right, on your hands if you, in fact, you realize that you cannot share information in this way. So you need to stop and think about this and start looking at the techniques that you can use in here. So to summarize, all I've done is I've shown you two very quick techniques that you can use. One is a context diagram. That's the spider-looking thing that I've just shown you. The other is assembling a high-level scenario. But let's summarize the information that we now have, okay? Summarize that information. What I figured out very quickly are my in-scope use cases. Taking an order, receiving an order, pricing an order, preparing an order, delivering an order, modifying an order, canceling an order. I figured out my out-of-scope components. All the purchasing-related functionality, not there. The customer automation, the customer management system is not going to include functionality to conduct direct marketing. It's not going to do eat-in orders. It's not going to do the automated loyalty. I've got a set of in-scope scenarios, however, that you do need to deal with. And more importantly, I've got a set of in-scope roles or actors, and those people, I know who is connected to what area of the business. So I now know who I need to talk to go figure something out. How far have I now come? Asking very, very few questions. How far have I come? I've got a pretty good sense, right? Using these two techniques, what have we accomplished? We now know the stakeholders that must be involved. We know roughly how many processes we'll need to analyze, roughly. Now, granted, you know what? You're going to have a lot of variability in that, and the reason why you're going to have a degree of variability in what the processes are is because, I think, who was it that said earlier, what if the stakeholders don't know what they want? Well, there's going to be a degree of they may not know all of their processes, and that's fine, or they may be having two different people using this different words to describe the same thing twice, right? And you know how many high-level interfaces you're going to be dealing with. Whitney, can this be used for modifications to an existing system? Absolutely. It should be one of your go-to processes. It doesn't matter what it is you're facing. Just general business consulting stuff. Make this your go-to process. Tell me what is in, signing up kids for Little League. Whatever it is, you just go to that. At what point in time do you ensure you have the right people at the table? Right now, Ruth, you've got to figure out you've got the right people. Your stakeholders tend to be upper management. They're not involved with what actually happens. Well, what you want to do is you want to sit down and say, well, who understands that process? Because they're going to assign people to work with you. So when you get down to this level and you start saying, well, listen, what we're talking about is a customer order management system, and we're looking at the pricing of it, and we're looking at this piece over here, you're specific enough that upper management can assign a particular person to you, Ruth, to work through that. And the reality will be is that it will never be, well, oftentimes it's not just one person. Oftentimes it is a group of people that have to come together and decide how something is to be done. And that's where the complexity lies, is when you go down this path that I'm telling you about right now, you identify those areas where there are multiple stakeholders interacting with a single process. You don't have the ability to just go to one person and get the answer in that circumstance. You have to work with the team. And as a result, you need to know where you're going to ask management to give you more people. I've seen this and used this under Element K tutorials. Okay. Sorry, Kent, I'm just trying to understand it because it's kind of long, right? Understand this is part of financial component. Okay, so what you're saying, I think, is that you disagree with one aspect of the way we're doing this, and that's the business must receive money or the system is broken, and that you need to have a financial component. So I agree, Kent, that at some point in time you have to have money, and money has to flow, or else you can't fix the problem. Absolutely, 100%, I agree with you on that front. The issue is, what do you do first? It's because you get into the chicken and egg thing. When you got to ask for money, but you don't know how big it is, and then you got to know how big it is before you can ask for money. You got to break out of that chicken and egg thing and have a go-to process that is very, very thin, all right? As a result, you can move it forward without a lot of this deliberation, right? So in this case here, you know these three things, and assuming you have a consistent process for listing requirements, You know roughly how much time is going to be needed from the stakeholders to define the requirements. And at that point in time, you can go and ask the business for cash, because you know roughly what the next piece of this thing is going to cost, right? So you now have a much better sense of what it is. So you got to add in that context of momentum, which is a little bit of what Kent is alluding to here, because you've got to say, what is the total process around this? You're not just going to say, oh, we do these two things, and therefore all of a sudden the world as we know it, like if I just crystallize using Keith's requirement scoping techniques, my life will be better. No, it works in a process that, at some point in time you become aware that a large project is lurking and it's got your name on it, and then you're going to do something, right? And then you're going to use these techniques, and then you're going to do something else, and then you're going to recognize that the project has momentum. We have to put this in the context of a business and a business flow. So what do you need to know before you start scoping? Do you need to have a bucket of cash? Well, yeah, maybe if you're, a vendor or something like that, but the vast majority of you are not. So the vast majority of you, the only thing that you're going to need or get is maybe a project name. And that's because it's just convenient rather than calling it the Phoenix Project or the Blue Jay or whatever it is, which I've done in the past because people wouldn't give me a name, right? But if you don't have just that name, it's useful to ask a couple of basic questions if you can get a little bit more, which is, what are the outcomes you need to achieve by implementing? You focus on the outcome. It's a lot easier than what are the objectives, right? What do you want to achieve? So if you were successful in having this thing in place, what would that success look like? Give me the business objectives. Think about the stakeholders 6 or 12 months from now. Again, future stating things really helps people be clearer with you. So how would I measure this is the project description. Tell me what would happen in the future that's different. That's really helpful because you're future stating it. Business risks will also tell you if there's a high degree of concern on the project executive side about certain things. But you don't need these questions answered per se. It's just handy to have them. What are some of these assumptions that you're thinking are going to happen along the way? A lot of times you get something like that question 4, people will have difficulty answering it at this stage, right? Because they don't know or they haven't necessarily made some assumptions. But it could be driving their thinking, so it's good to ask the question, right? Now, what you want to do is have some intake, but some companies have such a heavy intake of, the amount of information I need to give you as an analyst is so heavy that I'm not able to provide you that information as a business. So as a result, I end up providing you just a ton of junk that took me forever to produce, and I'm now married to as a business, rather than engaging professional analysts much earlier in the process. And as a result, those people who are brought in much earlier in the process are able to streamline it and execute on that process faster. Because after you're done scoping, what do you need to do? So after you've done that set of techniques of asking a few questions and crystallizing this whole thing, what do you need to do? You need a process for setting the scope of analysis. That should be formal, but it's also adaptive. What you're trying to do is set a requirements definition and management plan. Okay? Think of it this way. You're going to do a scoping session of some kind. When we do small ones, in other words, if one of you today approached me and said, hey, Keith, listen, I want you to help me and engage on a project. It's about $1 million client-side spend. I would just do these questions over the phone. You'd see me asking exactly this set of questions over the phone, and I'd have this thing figured out in terms of how big it was, roughly in about an hour or so conversation. It's a little bit bigger, maybe 2 hours if I happen to have a consultant in the area and they're just on site. Maybe they take a couple of hours with you and we actually get to a full requirements definition management plan. But you have to have some forum in here of being able to deal with the intake and the asking of these questions. The next thing is you need to create the requirements work plan. I can't remember which one of you, a couple of you mentioned, hey, this is the main outcome that we need to accomplish. But you do need to size the work for your stakeholders. If I am going to go forward with the requirements, I am now asking you as the business to commit a certain amount of resource to me as the analyst to interact with together to go get the requirements figured out. If I don't tell you how much it is and how many hours and what format and the days and all that sort of stuff, you're not going to commit the resources, or you're not going to fully commit them, or you're going to think something's different than what I'm thinking, and it's not going to work all that well. The last thing is you need a requirements plan of some kind. And this is always going to be formal, but it's adaptive, because if you're dealing with a little $1 million thing, you know what, you're not going to have a lot of fidelity in the plan. You're going to have maybe page of information on what it is you're going to do and how you're going to do it, all that sort of stuff. But if you're dealing with a $60 million, $70 million, $80 million project, which we are oftentimes doing at IAG, this has got to be clear because you're coordinating, somewhere between 100 and 300 stakeholders. Imagine that. We're doing one now. It's got 200 stakeholders involved. It's something like 10,000 hours of pulling the requirements out of these people. If they don't know where they're going, when they're going there, what techniques they're going to be using, what information to bring with them when they get there, all that basic stuff, they're going to shoot you. They're going to kill you at the end of the day. It's got to be coordinated. So the requirements management plan or the requirements plan always includes these basic elements: the stakeholders, the scope in terms of the estimate of time required to do certain things. You're identifying what part of the process you're dealing with on which days, the strategy for doing certain things, the tools, meaning the technologies involved, which people tend not to do, but it's really important, the level of detail in the documentation, which is critically important, the documents to be produced, etc., all those kinds of things. And then somebody was asking me questions about the business requirements, so the business objectives earlier. What I want you to think about in the objectives is translating, because a lot of people give you statements of objectives and they're just a mixed bundle of stuff, all right? So the first thing I want you to do is start thinking about, are they actually handing you objectives? And objectives are always SMART. They're specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bounded. Objectives measure the achievement of a goal. And goals elaborate the vision of what it is you are trying to achieve. Think about those three layers, and it's going to be very helpful for you to take what they're saying and slot it into one of those three buckets. Is this an objective I'm looking at, a goal, or a vision statement, or statement generically of the vision? And if it is, okay, well, maybe what I'm doing is I'm just missing pieces or people getting, yes, Vanessa, if you send me an email or send Adrian an email, we'll turn around and send you the presentation itself. Please repeat the objectives goals thing. Okay, Teresa, vision statement on the top of your sheet of paper, okay? Vision is enabled by goals. Vision is enabled by goals, which are measured by objectives. There's three layers in there, okay? Goals are measured by objectives. And if you do that, it will help you to organize the objectives-related information that you get. When something is an objective, you should run it through the SMART test and say, is this actually specific, measurable, and all that sort of good stuff, okay? Here's an example of a requirements work plan. For this one here, I think this was a $10, $15 million type project, something like that, right? And you've got to be communicating. Requirements is all about, and requirements work plans are all about communicating. What is it that you want to accomplish? Joseph, you got to send me the email itself. Don't just stick it in the Q&A area, because I'll miss it in the Q&A area, right? And 900 people on the phone here, I'm going to get a fair number of emails at the end of this thing. So the example work plan that's here, it will change. It might only be a page or a paragraph or two paragraphs, right, that you've got together on this thing. But what that allows you to do is it allows you to formalize and say, this is what you're trying to deal with. Why plan the level of detail and requirements documentation? There's a couple of reasons for this, and this is going to help you project managers out there and analysts, okay? You can't assume one size fits all. So if you're doing a COTS kind of implementation, you need to think about that the level of detail and fidelity you need is lower than that. You don't need as much detail as, say, if you're going to do a design build offshore, that type of thing. So you've got to step back and say, there are certain factors that you want to consider. And this is how you do your work planning for your analysts, okay? So if you ever gone and say, hey, we're going to use cases, and every single one of the analysts comes back with a different level of detail, well, this is what you do to fix it. What you do to fix it is you say, the focus in the use case is this. It's process level, business activity level, or task function level. The style, semi-formal or formal. You may have a template that's highly rigid, in the way you do it, or you may be using a more semi-formal style, which is what IAG uses. The detail, high, medium, or low, which is the comprehensiveness of each statement or set of statements in the use case. So, for example, if you just look at a process flow chart, or a process flow diagram, you got bubble, 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 decision points, etc. That's basically a use case. But the thing is that it's low fidelity, it's low detail. You're just using verb, noun, verb, noun, verb, noun, right, all the way down through your description. versus something where you've got, a couple of paragraphs or a page of information on how that process works, right? The visibility, black box versus white box. You could just be saying black box is, process the Visa card or receive the authorization number. There's no actual detail on how that physically works. And sometimes you don't need it, right? Versus white box, which actually gives you all the detail on how something works. And then the type, which is the business or the system design, right? And they're different levels. So you need to be specific. And by the way, the level of information may evolve. So at one point in time, you say, okay, well, now we're going to have the business requirements, and it's going to include the first level of detail across all of these, and then the next level is actually the system requirements, and it's going to include this next level of detail. But it means that you're clearly communicating the requirements, right? Stephanie, how do you get management sponsored to accept the time and effort needed to be put into these steps? And how do you convince them of its value? Great question, Stephanie. The first thing you need to do is you need to say, what are the process areas that we're covering? And make that more detailed. So, if you're saying we're doing customer order management, and then you're saying we're doing pricing, and then inside pricing you say, okay, and there's these 4 or 5 things, the management team will start clambering all over themselves saying, wow, it's going to take us more than this period of time to go look at that set of processes. There's just too much stuff to talk about. People tend to be pragmatic and not want failure, but they don't want to waste their time either. So if you sit back and say, okay, we're going to do pricing, and then you're very abstract as to what that means, then they will not give you a lot of time allocated on a calendar of anybody's calendar. But if you're very clear about, okay, well, pricing requires, the setting of the price for the annual calendar, the uploading of that price into the annual calendar, the determination of price constraints and rules and blah, 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 the more detailed you can be about it, the more time they're likely to give you to go and discuss it. How do you stop yourselves from talking technical design in these documents? Is that necessary? Yeah, Balaji, it is absolutely essential, and you govern that through the methodology, right? So you focus it back on the process first and foremost. What does the business want to accomplish rather than how? Isn't documentation detail underestimated? It can be, Mary. It depends on what you're doing. We run in an iterative way of going from requirements, scoping, and then a business requirements, and then down into the design documentation. And so when you do it that way, you're actually pulling other stuff outside of the requirements process, which gets built into you're into now design activities like technical architecture and things like that. So there's going to be more pieces to it than just this initial stage of defining the business requirements of it along the way. So you do have other layers like the technical architecture and things like that, which are design oriented. But you do have to have this material if you're going to have any hope of accuracy whatsoever. So step back and think about this now, just for a second, and simplify the process. Use requirements and the requirements techniques to define and drive your project. When do you know your project is organized and has momentum? When you have scope, you know the stakeholders, and you have a workable requirements plan. So what do? We use 2 basic techniques that helps us identify that scope, identify who those stakeholders are, and translate that from scope to requirements plan, right? Simple set of techniques, inject into the process. And how do you know when you've got a general expression of interest in the project? Well, when the stakeholders agree to the action plan. And this is the one thing I think, I'm not sure if it was Kimberly, it was Stephanie. What if they're not willing to give you the time? Well, then it's, in my definition, it's not a project. Go have your management think of something else for you to do. And I know that's a very harsh line, and maybe it's a little bit laughable to say, oh my God, how can we stand up to these people like that? Well, to some extent, you need the resources you need to go get the thing done. And if people are not willing to contribute that, then, well, I don't see how this is going to work. Okay, so you need to think about it as it is a project when the stakeholders agree to the action plan and they commit. You can together commit the required resources to go get it done, right? That way, for sure, everybody understands what is required, and it's a much better equal balancing of. It's a much stronger approach to ensuring that something is properly resourced. How long does it take you to get from concept to I said business requirements here. It's just momentum is the word that should be in there. It should never be more than 2 weeks. Okay, you should be able to generate a ton of momentum in a couple of weeks on something. For us, 70, 80 million, $100 million project. Oftentimes we're generating a ton of momentum in that 2-week interval. And fully organizing, who are the 300 stakeholders and how do we get them onto the project and where do we align them on the project, these are the kinds of things. So it's important for you in the early stages of being assigned to a project to be able to generate that momentum. I want you to also recognize the complexity of organizations because you've got to have that real-world spice. A lot of you are saying, well, what about this and what about that? What about the business case? Is it reasonable for the business analyst to be doing that? And okay, well, what happens if it's a stupid idea and we really shouldn't be funding that in the first place? What I want you to do is recognize that in the early stage of our project, you've got 3 independent yet interdependent processes that are all interwound. It's like a big ball of fur, okay, that you've got to untangle. It's corporate governance. Is this a stupid idea or not a stupid idea? Project management, which is, do we have a budget? What is the budget? What's the timeline? How are we going to manage that timeline? What are the project objectives? Are we going to hit those objectives or not? And then the business requirements, which is, what is this darn thing that we're trying to build? And what's the business need that we're trying to fulfill in here? Okay? 3 independent but interdependent. You need to think about it this way. 3 independent but interdependent because they're totally different skill sets, totally different set of people involved in each one of these things, totally set of underlying techniques that you're going to be using involved in each of these things. They're different. They're different. Separate them out. And recognize when you're crossing the threads and you're trying to tie the threads together because it will help you accelerate. But that doesn't mean that you can't use one to accelerate the other. So if I do it the way I'm talking about, which is defining the scope of analysis or scoping of analysis, right? It's not the scope of the overall project. It's just the scope of stuff that we need to look at in the project, right? And I start with that business analysis thread. What am I driving to each of the other threads? Well, from a governance perspective, I'm driving a set of information like what are the business areas impacted, smart business objectives, what stakeholders are interacting with this thing, and a general concept of project size, right? Like this is small, medium, or large. The project manager is getting what are the in-scope, out-of-scope activities and variations, the elicitation plan, time, the risks, issues, and assumptions, those basic set of things, and the requirements, deliverables we need to produce, in addition to the work breakdown structure on going and getting the requirements. And oh, by the way, did the team agree to that work breakdown structure? You're kick-starting the momentum in these other areas. You're breaking the logjam. You're reducing the war down to, here are some inputs that you need to make this happen. And I'm going to challenge you with this, okay? Because this is what happens in organizations. Which comes first? Detailing the business process or having a good business case? Which one? Tell me. Which comes first? Having sponsors with committed objectives or having a project charter? Which comes first? Having the requirements or having the project scope? What I'm saying is, don't play that game. It's a chicken and egg. As soon as you answer one, there are interdependent issues on the other side. That's right, they're functionally the same way. Hey, there you go. There are interdependent issues on both sides. You have to have a simple go-to action plan. All I'm doing is I'm taking one from one thread and one from the other thread and asking you that question. Have the requirements or have the scope, right? I'm just taking one off of each of those prior threads of governance, project management, and business requirements. Don't play that game. Have a simple go-to action plan that always works. Use the set of techniques that we're talking about. It'll break the logjam. You can move it forward. Some closing thoughts, and there's lots of great questions. You can continue to tinker away and put those questions into the Q&A area and see just how fast I can answer these things. But guiding principles using this approach, there's some basic things that I want to suggest to you, okay? You need to architect the process a large, let me say it again, large quantity of at a relatively low cost and do it very quickly, okay? The reality is in here is that when you're dealing with this kind of pre-project stage, there's huge numbers of ideas. And some of them are dumb, some of them are really good, some are going to go forward and get funded, and some of them are going to fold into a bunch of others and get left. So the reality is that you need to deal with that. And so if you architect a huge thing in here that requires all this documentation, people need to fill in a bunch of forms and blah, 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 it'll never work. You need to have something that runs quickly and efficiently. In this case here, I've described a process that for a $2 million client-side spend, meaning they're going to spend $2 million to build it alone, not just implement, but build it. It's going to be like 2 hours overhead to 4 hours overhead on the business. That's not a lot, okay, on an idea that could move forward. You got to set standards in the workflow that always, always, always work. If you're going to ask the business to make some sort of description and fill in a form, they had better know what they're doing and how they're doing it. So and the chances are they won't. So you may want to centralize this back to a set of analysts, but make sure you've got some ideas that will always work, rather than, all of a sudden this one here is costs and likely to be a purchase, and this one over here is something else. You can't have that variability. There's way, way, way too much creativity going on in the early stages of project inception. Way too much creativity. This should be boring. It should be really boring for you. Oh, it's a new project. My gosh, we got to go do the Keith process again, right? Because if it's like that, then it's easy for you. It replicates fast. You can train people to do it. Don't re-architect everything about the way you do your projects. Okay, there's no point in trying to change out your entire project management framework simply to add this thing in there. What you probably want to do is be very surgical about it. Say, you know what, there's 2 or 3 things that I need to inject into it, and they may actually be happening before my project framework kicks in and allow me to smooth my input into it, right? People realizing a concept is unworkable has to be a successful outcome. And this is one of those things where people need to say it's okay to have a project idea that's not all that good. We just need to figure that out on the way through and then take those out. So just to recap the learning objectives before I get to the last slide, because I think at some point in time they're going to get annoyed if I go a half hour over. So the learning objectives, let's make sure that I cover these off inside the project intake. What is it about this that makes it so dysfunctional? There's a lot of stuff in here that makes this dysfunctional. And I think I've covered that off in the beginning, talking about the process, what that process is about, and why people tend not to do well in that process, because there's not specific triggers, actions, and outcomes. The action plan, a couple of very specific things that you can do, and wanting to put that into context for you. So how does that work in a business process itself, and what are the targeted results of that? Because there's certain deliverables that you do need to produce that you can use to architect change in your organization. You architect change by saying, how do I get agreement with my stakeholders to participate? How do I get agreement with people that these are the right set of deliverables that we're going to focus on producing in the next stage of this thing, because that set of deliverables will bring momentum to my overall project on the way through. Typical next steps. Let me remind you all that we're in the business of doing business requirement stuff. If you're interested in that kind of thing, why don't you give me a call and we'll talk about it on your projects, or ones that get away on you, that kind of thing. Happy to do that and have that conversation or introduce you to the right people in our organization that can help you out. In the interim, though, there is a ton of material. We're actually upgrading our site today, so the site might be a little bit flaky when you look at it. 1 minute it'll be one thing, 1 minute it'll be dramatically different, but take a look at the site, www.iag.biz. There's a ton of detail there. Kevin, you got to send me your email address if you're going to request stuff from me. And then, if you're interested in, your ugly ducklings, you got to get that fixed. That's fabulous. So I'm going to go back and, Dominic, my email address is on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. I must have anticipated Dominic and Matthew's question, kls@iag.biz. Send me the email, and I will turn around and send you my slides, okay, on the way through. I have to run to a meeting. William, you have a great time at the meeting, okay? Time check. That's got to be Ben who's telling me that I'm going to run overtime if I don't wrap up quick. When the business wants to pursue a project, should the business analyst be involved in the beginning to ensure the efficient detail is captured? Mike, absolutely, I would espouse that position. In fact, the business analyst may well be the owner of this set of processes. Or it could be that it's a project manager. Like, it's kind of hard to say which one of those 2 roles is really going to pick that up, right? I want to big thank you, Bundle of Teaching. Thank you very much, Kelvin. You have a great day. How do you implement this strategy into a project that has already been started? Not much has been documented except for the stakeholders bring the BA into the project. The project appears to be a mess. How do you untangle it? Carol, the first thing I would do is use this set of techniques I'm talking about here. Okay, let's say it's a customer order management system that you're coming into and it's been going for a while and it's a mess. The first thing you need to do is refresh and say, okay, let's make sure we understand what are the business processes that this thing is touching. Who are the people who own those processes? Were they involved and what have they done? I mean, that's the basic set of techniques that you would use. Now, invariably what you're doing is you're being very politic about it. You're being very polite about the due deference to the ton of other work that people may have done and the production of documentation that they may have been involved in. And you're going to say, oh, of course, we're going to leverage that, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, this is how we're going to use it, blah, blah, blah. And there may be other things that you need to do in there which add a little bit of complexity, but the basic set of processes remain the same. I hear Ben breaking in.
Yeah, I'm just, you tie it up. You can answer a couple more questions. I'm not going to stop you from doing that, and then we'll finish her up.
The materials. Okay, so if you got to run to another one, running to another webinar. Love the fact you keep saying BA should be brought in the process. Ruth, absolutely you need to start doing that, because the problem with this fundamentally is that people tend not to see it as a process. They tend not to see it as something that exists, this whole idea of crystallization. And when you don't recognize that it exists, you tend not to fund it and say, we need some amount of our available business analysis capacity here to do this kind of thing. We actually implement these as requirements factories into companies, and you get like a 20% productivity gain just by doing these basic things that I'm talking about today. Let's see, copy. Yes, Ken, if you want a copy, you got to send me an email, okay? Otherwise, 900 people, I'm not going to be able to filter it out and go get them. Can I get
so everybody knows, we're going to have a recording of this up on the Modern Analyst site here in a day or so. So, you know, don't worry about that. We'll get that to you.
Well, fabulous. And I don't want to run overtime too much here anyway. So, look, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ben to kind of wrap up. But with that, let me thank you all for your participation today and wish you all great success.
Thank you, Keith, for a very informative presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with slides, will be archived at